Nobody believed me when I said the cookie had eyes. Not painted on real eyes, glossy and wet. I didn't buy it. That was the first thing I was sure of. The second was that it didn't belong in my apartment. But there it was, standing on the counter, its stubby arms slightly outstretched, as if mid-sentence. Its face was crafted with precision, a curved, frosting smile. 2 dark raisins for buttons. But those eyes, they weren't raisins. They were something else entirely. I tried to laugh it off at first. Maybe someone left it as a joke. A co-worker? No, I'd been fired weeks ago. A neighbor? Maybe. But why? The absurdity of it all should have amused me. It didn't. The cookie didn't look funny. It looked wrong. I live alone in an apartment that feels less like a home and more like a waiting room for my next bad decision. The walls are beige, the furniture sparse. There's a faint hum from the fridge that fills the silence when the world outside decides to ignore me, which is most of the time. So the presence of this intruder, this impossibility, felt like a violation, a fracture in the mundane. The first night I didn't touch it. I left it there on the counter. But I couldn't stop glancing at it as I moved through my evening routine. When I brushed my teeth, I left the bathroom door open, just to keep an eye on the kitchen. It was ridiculous, really. I mean, it's a cookie. It's not like it's going to move, right? By the time I crawled into bed, I'd convinced myself it was all a mix-up. I'd throw it out tomorrow and forget about it. I closed my eyes and let the ambient hum of the fridge lull me to sleep. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up. Something had pulled me out of a deep, dreamless sleep. A sound, maybe. A faint shuffle or the softest crunch. I lay there for a moment, letting my heart settle, before deciding it was nothing. The mind plays tricks in the dark, after all. I rolled over, letting my face sink into the pillow. But I swear I could feel it watching me. The next morning, the gingerbread man was still there, right where I left it, except it wasn't quite the same. Its smile seemed wider, not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable. I stared at it, waiting for some logical explanation to present itself, but none came. Instead, a slow, prickling sensation crawled up my spine, like I was being observed. Not by something kind, but by something curious. "All right," I muttered, breaking the silence as if the sound of my voice could reclaim the space. "Enough of this." I grabbed a plastic bag, scooped the cookie inside, and tied it tight. It felt oddly heavy in my hands, denser than it should have been. Without thinking too much, I tossed it in the trash can outside. I slammed the lid down for good measure. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. The gingerbread man was back on the counter the next morning. The bag was gone. No crumbs. No trace of it ever leaving. Just that stubby, smiling figure staring at me with those unblinking eyes. I didn't eat that day. My appetite evaporated. Every time I walked past the kitchen, my gaze drifted toward it. I tried to distract myself, watched TV, scrolled through my phone, even cleaned parts of the apartment I hadn't touched in months. But the cookie remained in the back of my mind, like a pebble in a shoe I couldn't shake loose. By nightfall, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the cookie, its frosting grin taunting me, and hurled it into the garbage disposal. I flicked the switch and listened as the blades roared to life, chewing through the hardened dough. Relief washed over me, until I looked up. It was there again, on the counter, intact, watching. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The hum of the fridge was no longer comforting. It was a reminder of the silence around it, of the silence broken only by the faintest sound, like a crunching noise coming from the kitchen. By the third morning, I stopped pretending this was something I could ignore. I tried reasoning with myself. Hallucinations, stress, sleep deprivation. But no amount of logic could erase what I saw or the way those eyes seemed to follow me as I paced the room. It was the smell that finally broke me. Sweet, sickly cinnamon mixed with something else. Burnt sugar, maybe. It hung in the air, clinging to the back of my throat. The gingerbread man didn't just exist in my apartment. It had started to claim it. I grabbed it one final time, this time wrapping it in layers of duct tape before tossing it into a box. I drove 3 miles to the nearest dumpster and threw it in. I watched the lid close, convinced that this would be the end of it. I was wrong. When I got home, it was waiting for me. Not on the counter this time. No, that would have been merciful. It was sitting on my bed, its frosting smile curved upward in what I can only describe as delight. And then, as I stood frozen in the doorway, I swear I heard it laugh. The cookie wasn't on the bed when I woke up. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Instead, it was back on the counter, like it had never left. The frosting smile was exactly as I remembered it, almost too perfect, but something was off. The eyes, those dark, glossy eyes, seemed deeper somehow, like they were trying to say something I couldn't understand. I didn't go near it. Not that morning, not for hours. I just sat on the couch, staring at it from a distance, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. The screen was blank. Who would I even call? What would I say? Hi, there's a cookie in my kitchen, and it's watching me. Yeah, no. That wasn't happening. It started with the crumbs. That night I heard the sound again, the faint crunching, like something brittle breaking under pressure. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear more. The noise stopped as soon as I moved, leaving only silence. I stayed still, ears tuned to the quiet. Minutes passed. Then I noticed the smell. Sweet, cloying cinnamon mixed with burnt sugar. It wasn't like before. This was stronger, almost choking. My throat tightened as I forced myself to get out of bed. I grabbed my phone, using its screen to light the way. The crumbs started at my bedroom door. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. They trailed down the hall, leading into the kitchen. My hands were shaking, but I followed them, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. The gingerbread man wasn't on the counter. It was sitting on the edge of the sink, its stubby legs dangling over the side, like a child kicking their feet. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, willing it to stay still. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I blinked. The crumbs under its feet were gone. The misdirection almost worked. The next day, my neighbor Sarah stopped by. She was one of the few people in the building who even acknowledged my existence, usually with polite but brief small talk. This time she lingered at the doorway, her face a mask of concern. "Hey," she said, her voice hesitant. "Everything okay? I heard, noises last night, like something fell." I almost told her. The words were there, sitting heavy on my tongue. But then I glanced back at the kitchen, where the cookie sat motionless on the counter, its smile mocking me. What was I supposed to say? That it had been sitting on the sink, eating its own crumbs? That it moved when I wasn't looking? "Just dropped something," I mumbled instead, forcing a weak smile. "Nothing to worry about." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. "All right. But if you need anything, let me know, okay?" Her words hung in the air after she left, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stayed by the door for what felt like hours, staring at the cookie, waiting for it to prove me wrong. It didn't wait long. That evening, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to live like this, jumping at shadows and smells. I grabbed a pair of tongs and picked up the gingerbread man, holding it at arm's length like it might bite me. Its smile didn't waver, but I could have sworn its eyes gleamed in the dim light. I placed it in a shoebox, duct taped the lid shut, and shoved it into the farthest corner of the closet. Out of sight, out of mind, that was the plan. I even managed to convince myself it would work. But later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. Crunch, crunch. This time it was louder. The smell followed soon after, thick and suffocating. My chest felt tight, and my eyes watered as the cinnamon clawed its way into my lungs. I bolted upright, my gaze snapping to the closet door. It was ajar. No, the box was there, just as I'd left it, the tape untouched. But when I opened it, the cookie was gone. In its place were more crumbs, thicker, stickier, as if soaked in something wet. And then I heard the laugh. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send me stumbling backward. My hands scrabbled at the doorframe as my knees buckled, my pulse hammering in my ears. The laugh came again, faint and drawn out, echoing through the apartment, and then it stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the cookie was back on the counter. Only now there was something new. Scrawled across the surface in fine, sugary powder were two words, "Still hungry." The edges of reality began to fray. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My entire world narrowed to that one thing on the counter. I tried ignoring it, but it was impossible. Every time I turned away, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, small, sharp jerks, like it was trying to break free from its sugary form. The shadows in the apartment grew darker, deeper, stretching toward it as if drawn by some unseen force. The air felt thicker, heavy with the scent of burnt sugar. I didn't know what to do, who to call. All I knew was that it wouldn't stop. By the end of the third night, I was too exhausted to fight it anymore. I sat at the table, staring at the gingerbread man, my thoughts spiraling. Was it laughing at me? Or was it something worse? The cookie didn't answer. It just stared back, unblinking. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. By the fourth night, the rules of my reality had unraveled. The gingerbread man didn't stay in the kitchen anymore. It followed me, not directly, not in ways anyone could see, but in ways I could feel. No matter where I went in the apartment, it was there. If I turned my back for too long, I'd find it sitting somewhere else. The edge of the couch, the bathroom sink, the knitstand beside my bed. Every time its frosting smile was the same. Mocking, gleeful. But its eyes, they were darker now, almost black, and seemed to draw the light out of the room. It wasn't just a cookie anymore. The entire apartment began to shift. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch farther than they should. The hum of the fridge grew louder, deeper, like a low growl reverberating through the air. I heard noises that didn't belong, soft, scuttling sounds, like tiny feet skittering across the floor. And the smell, God, the smell. It wasn't just cinnamon and sugar anymore. It was rancid, like burnt molasses mixed with decay. It coated my mouth and nostrils, clinging to me even when I stepped outside. Not that the outside helped. I tried leaving the apartment, walking to the corner store to clear my head, but the feeling followed me. The moment I stepped back inside, the air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. The gingerbread man was waiting for me, perched on the dining table like a host welcoming a guest. I tried destroying it again. This time I didn't hold back. I grabbed it with my bare hands, ignoring the sticky residue that clung to my fingers, and slammed it into the sink. I turned on the garbage disposal and watched as the blades churned it into chunks. But when I turned around, it was on the counter, completely intact, its smile wider than before. I tried burning it next. I lit the stove, cranked the flame as high as it would go, and threw the cookie into the fire. The smell was unbearable thick and acrid, filling the room like a noxious fog. I watched the edges of the gingerbread man curl and blacken, but just as quickly it reformed itself, whole and untouched. It didn't stop there. That night I woke to find burn marks on my arms, tiny, seared imprints of hands no bigger than a child's. The gingerbread man was sitting on my chest, its weight impossibly heavy, its frosting smile inches from my face. I screamed, answers, or something like them. By the next morning I was desperate. I hadn't slept in days, hadn't eaten, and I couldn't keep this thing in my life anymore. I started researching haunted objects, cursed items, anything that might explain what was happening. Most of it was nonsense, vague stories and urban legends. But one thread caught my eye. A forum post, buried in a sea of conspiracy theories, mentioned a similar case. A man had found a strange object in his home, a doll, not a cookie, and described it as alive. His story was eerily familiar. The object moved when he wasn't looking. It couldn't be destroyed, and it filled his home with an overwhelming sense of dread. His post ended abruptly, with one final cryptic sentence. "It's hungry, and I fed it. Now it's too late." I wasn't alone. I started piecing things together. The neighbor, Sarah, she'd vanished. I hadn't seen her since the day she stopped by. Her door was locked, her mail piling up. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint, sugary smell wafting from under her door. Something was wrong. The cookie wasn't just haunting me, it was spreading or consuming. I pounded on her door, but there was no answer. The smell was stronger now, suffocating. I could have called the police, but what would I say? Instead, I stumbled back to my apartment, my pulse racing, my thoughts spiraling. The gingerbread man was waiting for me, sitting upright on the couch. Its eyes gleamed like polished onyx, its frosting smile impossibly wide. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the cookie and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall and crumbled to pieces, but before I could take a breath, the laughter began. It wasn't faint this time, it was loud, echoing through the apartment, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lights flickered, and the room grew cold. I backed into the corner, my chest heaving, as the crumbs on the floor began to move. They twitched and skittered, pulling themselves together, reforming. Within moments, the gingerbread man was whole again, larger than before, its frosting eyes now filled with something alive. "You're part of this now," it whispered. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were in my head, scraping against the walls of my mind like nails on glass. The cookie lunged at me, not physically, but its presence overwhelmed me, flooding my senses. I saw flashes of something I couldn't comprehend. Fire, ash, a woman kneading dough with hands stained red. I heard voices crying out, begging, their words drowned by the sound of crunching. I fell to the floor, clutching my head, trying to block it out. But the visions wouldn't stop. The cookie loomed over me, its sugary grin splitting wider, revealing teeth, jagged, razor-sharp teeth that shouldn't have existed. "Feed me," it said. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was madness. But I grabbed a piece of the cookie's arm, tore it off, and shoved it into my mouth. The taste was sickeningly sweet, mixed with something metallic. My stomach churned, but I swallowed anyway. The laughter stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then the cookie began to change. Its body twisted and cracked, its smile warping into something monstrous. It wasn't just a cookie anymore. It was alive, its limbs stretching, its form swelling. As I watched, frozen in terror, the gingerbread man leaned closer. Its eyes were now pits of darkness, endless and consuming. "You've fed me," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. Now I'll feed on you." The last thing I remember before blacking out was the feeling of its cold, sugary hands gripping my face. I woke up on the floor, gasping for air. My chest felt heavy, as though something had been sitting on it, pressing down with impossible weight. The apartment was dark, too dark. Even the faint light from the street lamps outside seemed swallowed by the shadows clinging to the walls. I wasn't alone. The gingerbread man was gone, but the feeling of its presence lingered like a cold breath against the back of my neck. My stomach churned violently, the taste of its sugary flesh still lingering on my tongue. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. The ground felt different, softer, like the floor itself had become doughy. That's when I noticed the walls. They were shifting, the familiar beige now warped and streaked with thick, dark lines of molasses. It oozed down in slow rivulets, pooling on the floor and sticking to my skin. The air was suffocatingly sweet, tinged with a faint bitterness that made my stomach turn. My apartment wasn't my apartment anymore, it was something else entirely. A sound broke through the oppressive silence. Faint footsteps, deliberate and heavy. They echoed unnaturally, as if the walls themselves carried the sound. My heart thundered in my chest as I turned toward the hallway. And then I saw it. The gingerbread man wasn't small anymore. It stood taller than me, its form grotesque and distorted. The once simple frosting had twisted into jagged lines, its buttons now resembling gaping wounds that oozed a dark, syrupy substance. Its eyes were voids, endless pits of darkness that seemed to pull me in. "You fed me," it said, its voice a guttural growl layered with echoes. "Now you will watch." It lunged toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping on the molasses-covered floor. It reached for me with stubby, clawed hands, and I felt a cold, sticky pressure wrap around my ankle. "Let go," I screamed, kicking wildly. My foot connected, and the gingerbread man staggered back, its frosting grin cracking slightly. But the laughter came again, loud and mocking, reverberating through the room. "You cannot escape," it said. "This is what you are." As I tried to crawl away, flashes of those haunting visions returned. The woman kneading dough, her hands slick with something red. The cries of the voices, desperate and pleading. The flames consuming everything. The images burned into my mind, fragments of a story I couldn't piece together. The gingerbread man loomed over me, its grin widening. "You've taken a bite," it whispered. "Now you're part of me." It grabbed me again, its sticky fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, thrashing against its grip, but it was too strong. My body felt heavy, as though the doughy floor beneath me was pulling me down, swallowing me whole. And then the visions clicked. The woman in the visions wasn't a stranger. She was someone I recognized, someone I'd forgotten. My grandmother. Her face was younger, her features sharper, but it was her. I remembered her baking when I was a child, the smell of cinnamon and sugar filling the house. I remembered her hands, always warm, always working, and I remembered the warning she gave me before she passed. Never take what isn't yours. Some recipes are meant to be left alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The cookie wasn't just some cursed object, it was a piece of her. A fragment of something she'd bound to her recipes, something she'd tried to bury. And now it was alive, feeding on the forgotten, the unwanted. It wasn't just going to take me. It was going to take everything. Fueled by desperation, I clawed at the sticky floor, pulling myself upright. The gingerbread man towered over me, its form shifting and expanding, its laughter filling the room. My hands found something sharp, a shard of glass from a shattered picture frame. I gripped it tightly, ignoring the way it cut into my palm. "You want me?" I spat, my voice shaking but defiant. "Then take me." I lunged at it, driving the shard into its chest. The gingerbread man let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the apartment. Its body convulsed, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then its eyes locked onto mine, and I realized my mistake. "You cannot kill me," it hissed. "You are me?" The gingerbread man's body began to collapse inward, pulling itself into the shard of glass still embedded in its chest. But as it did, I felt something pulling at me to a force I couldn't resist. My vision blurred and my limbs felt heavy, as though I was being dragged into it. The room dissolved around me, replaced by darkness and heat. The smell of burnt sugar and cinnamon was overwhelming, stinging my eyes and filling my lungs. My skin prickled, and when I looked down, I saw it. My hands were hardening, my fingers turning stiff and brittle. I was becoming it. The last thing I remember is the gingerbread man's voice, no longer external, but inside me, whispering in my mind, "Now you will watch." I woke up in darkness, but it wasn't my apartment. The air was thick and sweet, the walls slick with molasses. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, stiff, and brittle. My vision was narrow, as though I was looking through tiny holes. And then I saw her. A woman stood in the center of the room, her face pale and gaunt. She was holding a gingerbread man, staring at it with a mixture of fear and confusion. My heart sank as I realized what I was seeing. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the watcher. The cycle was starting again. The air was still, the sweet stench of burnt sugar clinging to my nostrils as I tried to move, but my body refused. I was trapped, frozen, my limbs stiff and unmoving, my eyes wide but helpless. I could feel the weight of the transformation, the unnatural rigidity of my body, like dough turning to stone. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even blink. The woman in front of me, my grandmother, I realized, stood motionless, her eyes hollow with fear. Her fingers trembled as she held the gingerbread man, turning it over in her hands. It was the same as it had always been, a grotesque, mocking grin, frosting edges cracked and stained with something dark. But now, in her hands, it seemed almost like a twisted promise. She had made it. She had been the one to bind this curse. I didn't understand how or why, but I knew it now. I knew the truth of it. The gingerbread man had come to life because it was never meant to be made. It was a creation not just of dough, but of something deeper, darker, a forbidden recipe passed down through generations, one that my grandmother had once warned me about. She had tried to hide it, bury it, but I had brought it back, and now it was mine to carry. And now, as I stared at her, I understood. The price wasn't just in the recipe. It was in the curse, the hunger, the endless cycle. The gingerbread man would never stop. It would continue to consume, to feed, to twist anyone who dared touch it into another part of itself. A part of this thing. I was no longer the victim. I was the watcher. The woman's hands were shaking. She knew what she had to do. She had to feed it, but she couldn't, not yet. Not until she felt its grip tightening around her, like I had. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I could see a flicker of recognition in them. She knew. She knew that I was no longer the person I had been. I was part of it now, part of the curse. And so I would watch as the next one came. Her hands shook harder, the gingerbread man's eyes glistening with hunger. The frosting on its face seemed to ripple, as if waiting for her to take the first bite. My mouth watered with an impossible craving, a craving I couldn't satisfy, a craving that would never end. My mind screamed, but my body remained still. All I could do was watch as the cycle began again. "Please," my grandmother whispered to herself, her voice strained. "Please don't let this happen again." But it was too late. The gingerbread man smiled, its eyes locking onto hers as if to say, "You're mine now." And as I felt the dark pull of it all around me, I realized the horrible truth. There is no escaping it. As I watched her take that first bite, the darkness closed in. The end? No, not really. It's just another beginning. Another victim, another cycle. And when you wake up one day, perhaps it will be your turn. You'll find a gingerbread man sitting on your counter, waiting for you, watching you,